Yeah, it's a curious story. I've been filming in Lakota country for 20 years, Pine Ridge Indian Reservation principally. And I was out there about 10 years ago showing a film, Res Bomb, a love story thriller that I'd shot there. I created like a mobile cinema, and I was showing it all around the reservation, and then I was showing it in this border town theater. And the author, Kent Nurburn, happened to be there, stumbled on it, approached me after with a copy of Neither Wolf Nor Dog. Told me that for years Hollywood had been circling around it, producers making grand promises what they were going to do with it, and it wasn't going anywhere, and he was getting tired of the Hollywood BS. And here he thought, would somebody actually get something made? And most importantly, tonally, it was very much from the reservation out rather than Hollywood in. And so he gave me a copy of the novel. I had no intention of making something like that, so I took ages to get around to reading it. But then it sort of spoke to me somewhat, and then he gave out this sort of desperate plea at one point to everyone who'd shown any interest, who's going to do it, who's going to do it. And I made him a promise I get it made by any means necessary. And then that was 8.5 years ago. And it's been any means necessary and more. Much more. Yeah, it's been quite a journey. Well, essentially, I mean, it's a road movie. This white author gets a call out of the blue to go meet this Lakota elder, and the Lakota elder wants him to distill down into a book basically what starts off as a box of notes, a source material of all these sort of thoughts he'd had over the years. But they quickly step beyond that, and they suck him into a road trip through the heart of the elder's world to really experience everything firsthand, so it's not in the sort of kind of neutral kind of way, but also to confront the author and his own preconceptions along the way as well. And in a sense, it was a vehicle for the writer to distill down a lot of real experiences he'd had with a native elder, and create a narrative structure for that. And the weird thing in the film is we kind of brought that back full circle, because the moment we started working with Dave Bald Eagle, he sort of brought it back into that core elder part. And then, we get to the point, for example, at the climax at Wounded Knee, we abandoned what was in the script and the novel, and he improvised the whole sequence, because in this rare thing in sort of film, we had someone playing a character who was closer to the events that being talked about than even the character. It was Dave's people that were involved in the massacre of Wounded Knee. And, Wounded Knee Massacre, many saw it as the 7th Cavalry's retaliation for their predecessors being wiped out at the Battle of Little Bighorn. And, Dave's grandfather was one of the key participants at the Little Bighorn. I mean, he was sort of front and center in his heritage with this story. One of the interesting things that I thought was good about the novel is that the typical way about a story like this is the sort of Green Book approach. You get somebody who's perhaps a bit of a racist, filled with all these prejudices going into a world like that. But here we have somebody that's actually a white academic, an intellectual, somebody who is very much kind of on the right side of the issues, and yet it sort of tests his boundaries and preconceptions and sort of forces him to see things from a different perspective. And not just one looking at it from a historical perspective, but it's kind of learning how to interface with the natural world in a different way, and how to even learn in a different way. And one of the interesting challenges as a filmmaker was I had to put the audience through the same experience. I had to create a film that quietened the audience down in the same way as the elder does the Nurburn character. And the audience has to start learning how to listen in a similar way. And it's interesting, one of the reasons why I've made sure it's been in cinemas for such a long time is it's a film best experienced in a theater, not in a spectacle way, or not even in a sort of Lawrence of Arabia kind of way, but energetically. It's funnier with an audience, they find the humor together, but also the emotion, it becomes a communal thing, and the tone. It's fascinating.
And how exactly do you achieve that? I mean, can you talk about cameras, about shot? How do you achieve what you just described?
It's an interesting thing. I think there's a part of any creativity where it's just transferred. It's like when you have an understanding of material, it's hard to put your finger on how it ends up on screen. One of the things I knew that was crucial was that nature had to be a character. When white people first arrived out there, they thought, how do we control nature? Like a farmer. We'll farm this land. And then after a generation or two in the Dust Bowl, things like that, nature said, you know, and then they became ranchers. They realized, you know, they could graze, but they can't control it so much. The native way is you listen to the land first, and it will teach you how to live on it. And so a lot of it was placing the characters within the frame, a lot of just nicely composed images. You know, I went into it with not much of a budget, so what's the best camera I can shoot it on? And, you know, at that point, you know, the Red One, which was still a great camera, always will be a great camera. You know, it was at a very good price point secondhand, so I managed to buy it and sell it, and it cost me hardly anything to shoot with. And, you know, but when you're shooting, I mean, it was like 125 or so shooting hours over 18 days. It was a breakneck speed, short days because you have a 95-year-old star. And so you really had to make your choice. This scene is going to be them sitting in nature. This scene is so intense that we're only going to be in very tight singles. This scene is a bit more frenetic, so it's going to be a single, very fluid, steady cam shot. And, you know, most of the scenes in the film had pretty much zero coverage. And I think, you know, it generally works out. You know, there's a few times you're kind of, you know, you wish you had a bit more to play with, but, you know, but the most important thing is trapping that energy, natural and interpersonal, depending on the scene. Well, when I went out there, I was supposed to have somebody local who's very experienced helping out. But he dropped out at the very last minute. And then I also had a sound recordist from the area, one of the only two experienced ones in the region, suddenly decided in the last minute that he was wanting to be much more expensive than we had agreed. So he was gone. And I had to scramble. And literally 4 days before we started shooting, I met the other one in the region who turned out to be, you know, the most magnificent person you could ever have on a crew or know in life. So, you know, it was one of those big disappointments that worked out amazingly well. But when you're shooting a micro budget, sound. Getting a great sound person is by far the most important thing. You can have cinematography that's rough around the edges, and people will just make it, it just feels like real life or whatever else. But the moment the sound is bad, you know. And so I was very fortunate there. And then the second miscellaneous crew person was whoever was around. You know, mostly doing clapperboard and one or two other things. And then everything else was on my shoulders. And then in pre-production and post all the way through going into cinemas was just myself. You know, color work, sound design, literally every part of it. But nobody's going to give you a budget when you've got a 95-year-old because you can't insure it. And the intimacy, though, allowed us to go far deeper, like, you know, in the climax of the film, you know, Dave improvising the whole thing from a very, very, very deep emotional place. You know, if there's 40 people standing behind, you know, a bunch of bagels being munched on and whatever else, a few people looking at their phone or whatever, he could never, ever, ever have gone where he went in that scene. The fact that it was just people he trusted gave us that. And you move so fast. It's easy to move two people around, you know. And it's all about what's through the lens. Nothing else matters. What's, you know, the sound and the picture. It's all that matters.
How did you find him?
Well, the casting to begin with, it sort of felt like the search for Scarlet, you know, and Gone with the Wind a bit. I was searching high and low, but there aren't many native actors of that generation. Well, the character was 80 years old in the novel. And there were a few native actors in their mid-70s. One of them was a dear friend of mine, Russell Means. First ever role was Last of the Mohicans, third lead in that. And he'd also been in the documentary of mine and also my previous movie on the res. But they all felt contemporary. And when the novel came out in the mid-90s, you know, this was a guy from a particular era. And that era, I needed somebody 15 years later, shooting 15 years later. So I got Dave at 95. He was 93 when I met him, and there were these 2 very tense years scrambling the whole thing together because if anything happened to him, I had to walk away. You know, there was no one else. He was beyond perfect. I thought he was perfect, and then I found out he was beyond perfect. And he was a joy to work with. He was fearless. And I remember we were shooting one day up on this hill in the middle of nowhere, and he'd always be sitting in the car with his wife, keeping warm. And I was doing the old sort of licking my finger, putting it up to the air, figuring out which way the wind was blowing, because it was quite a gale, and I didn't want it buffing the camera. And I look over to the car, and he's beside himself laughing. And Josie, his wife, beckoned me over. They wound down the window. And he's, crazy white guy, can you see which way the grass is blowing? It was hysterical. There were so many moments like that. And so he was extraordinary. And, you know, the beautiful thing is, you know, when you're shooting on a small budget, all you need is one actor to be a problem, and it really can mess up the whole thing. In this film, I couldn't have been luckier with the cast, but also when you have a 95-year-old star, he's the energetic focus of everyone. So, you know, the actors have, any notion they have of themselves kind of goes out the window, and you end up in this very kind of special place and playing this very special line with it. I mean, it's interesting when you have a white guy telling a story, but principally with a native cast and a white lead. You know, a lot of the conversation comes down to my depiction of the native characters and all these sorts of things, and that cultural aspect. To me, the key perspective on this film was, and I think this is what any other director more or less would have missed, is having the perspective on the white American character. Because my experience in Lakota country is incredibly different to Kent Nurburn's. Now, we're both very much embraced. Our work, and we've both got a considerable body of work there, is very much embraced there. But when he goes there, he talks very much about the shadow on the wall of history, when there's a white person and a native in the room, even if they've got a good relationship. And I, and many other Europeans I know who have great relationships out there, don't get that shadow projected on the wall. I see it's him doing the projecting more than the maybe Lakota or Ojibwe or whoever he's in the room with. And that was fascinating, and that really gave me the perspective on it. You know, in the opening scene where he meets the elder, he's trying to not put a foot wrong. He's trying to be as culturally sensitive as possible. Whereas there's nowhere I laugh my ass off more in the world than Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. There's nowhere I've had greater hospitality. And, you know, if it was me meeting that elder, and I've been in that situation many times, we'd have been cracking jokes within a minute. I'd be crashing on his couch that night. The next day, if his granddaughter didn't have a car, I'd be taking her and her kids to the nearest Walmart. That's just normal. That's how it is for me there. So that was the beautiful thing, getting the entry point to his character and being able to take it a step further than the novel with that depiction, because it's a first-person narrative in the novel. And he doesn't have that clarity of perspective on himself. And so that allowed to bring in a bit more dynamic and interplay with the characters as well. I mean, I think that's the thing as well, where, you know, we're in an age where there's an extraordinary conversation going on about who can tell what story. And you know, it's a great conversation, but like most things, it forgets the people who are in the most extreme part of it, which is the Native community, which is always what happens. You know, for example, 2 years ago when you had the extraordinary Black Lives Matter movement talking about, you know, young people being killed by cops, on all of that coverage, you never heard anyone talk about how, particularly that year, the people being killed at the highest proportion by cops in the US were Natives over any other group. They're still excluded from that conversation. And it's very much the same about who tells what story. Hollywood has done a worse job of depicting Natives than I think any other group in the history of cinema. It's been 100 years of pro-genocide cinema. And, you know, for example, if you were showing Birth of a Nation on TV right now, it would always be in a historical context. It would always have somebody at the beginning saying, yes, these deeply racist scenes are led to the atrocity of the rise of the, or re-rise of the KKK and many other atrocities, blah, blah, blah. Absolutely. And yet you can see 1,000 Westerns rebroadcast with scenes, almost shot-by-shot recreations of those scenes from Birth of a Nation, and no one will bat an eyelid. And So going into that territory is an interesting territory. But for me, I felt so comfortable with the characters, and also, most importantly, the people playing those characters. I don't think it was ever a thing to worry about. You know, Dave Bald Eagle would never have done anything inappropriate. I also knew where those lines are. We pulled stuff out of the script because we knew we would never film it culturally. But the thing I love the most is I never hear anyone in Lakota country tell me, oh, he did such a great job, he really depicted the Lakota people in an accurate way. I never hear that, and I'm thrilled. Because when they tell me, you know, that grandpa reminded me of somebody I knew when I was young, or she reminded me of this auntie I used to know, it's always individuals that the characters are reminding them of. And that's when I know we really nailed it, because we created such distinct individuals. And to me, when Hollywood goes in and tells Native films, they leave the fundamental part of their job at the door, which is create unique characters. And they fall upon the generic. Nowadays, it's harder and harder for them to do because they're casting people like the extraordinary Zahn McLarnon, who's in my movie, or Tatanka Means, or Roseanne Supernault, or, you know, some of these extraordinary actors who will always take a character to the next level. Thank goodness. Theatrical distribution is a very closed business. And even if you're going into it, it's almost impossible, for example, to find out who all the film buyers in the country are. And by that I mean the individuals that book films into all of the smaller cinemas around the country. You have to scour to find out who these people are. And it's an extraordinary amount of work to get a cinema interested. Now we're at the point of over 200 full-run cinemas. We've been in about 450 venues in Scotland. We're now at about 50 cinemas in the UK. About North America, about 450, and in the UK, about 50 so far. We've even been in Bulgarian cinemas, did quite well there. But every time it's an uphill battle, getting them interested. And you have to snowball it. You have to go where you know your story is going to be strongest and where you're going to pack out a cinema. And in our case, one of our very first in Bemidji, Minnesota, where the novel was written, you know, we beat 9 Hollywood films in a 10-screen multiplex. We ended up with 1,600 admissions in a town of 15,000. And so suddenly people start paying attention. Then we open in Minneapolis. We have more admissions than the film with the top screen average in the entire US that week. More people pay attention. But it's still very regional. And the reason I held off LA for the longest time is that big cities are harder to release in. Small towns are easy. It's very easy to spread the word. Very easy to market to. Some of the results we've had have been extraordinary. I mean, South Dakota, if you were to prorate to a national average, our box office, it would relate to us being about, the 48th most successful film in the US this year. And this is a film with a production budget of less than 30 grand.
So you're going market by market?
It's worked out that way. I mean, we won't turn down a cinema, but, you know, the ones that pay attention are typically in regions we've done well. But there's no logic to it. 10 minutes ago I got a message from, there's a booker wanting to book us in some cinema, I think it's around Utah. The last time we played a cinema there was 11 months ago. And we've been in cinemas 2.5+ years. And they're not, the cinemas aren't going, oh, but this isn't how you release a film. They go, oh, our audience hasn't seen it yet, let's try it. Seriously, art house cinemas are the most narrow-minded about this. It's far easier to get into regional commercial cinemas or multiplexes. And it's a lot of the, I think they're wanting things that have, done the standard release pattern. What did the New York Times say? What did the Cannes Film Festival say? And we've dramatically beaten a lot of those films. Just between Minnesota, South Dakota, Oregon, Washington, Montana, and we've been in 120 cinemas. It's less than 7% of the US market. But Fox Searchlight would be lucky to get 15 cinemas in there. Trying to get into some other markets. Texas was bad for us. Oklahoma was bad for us. It's a funny thing. You start to realize the film is a particular animal, and you have to start listening to how people are responding. But we do an incredible amount of work every market we go into. We treat every cinema as its own market.
So why do you think Texas didn't work out?
It's Texas. I don't know. I mean, I think it's, local media can make a huge difference. Do they see it as relevant to their area? We had a newspaper in Vancouver, Washington, that wrote this stunning article about the film. It was just impeccable, absolutely gathered in the essence of it. And we were this art house cinema's second best performing film of the year there. And we had 6 showings that week, and we beat 11 of the 12 summer blockbusters playing at the nearby multiplex. Only Wonder Woman beat us that week, and they had 35 shows to our 6. And if we didn't have that amazing article, it wouldn't have happened. And almost 2 years later, we returned to that cinema for an encore earlier this year. And in advance, it sold out the 337 seats, and then it came back for a few more showings. And in 4 showings, we did about the same business as we did in about 11 first time around. And the guy running the cinema said in his decades he hadn't seen anything like it. And yet the film industry doesn't pay any attention. Still does not pay any attention. I do not for a second believe that the pros couldn't have done 10 times the business with this film than I've done with their power. And don't for a second believe I could have done anything like it. And we've done 100,000 admissions, so they could have done 1 million admissions on this film. That would mean a 9-10 million gross. I don't think that would have been hard. I seriously don't think I'm that good that I could get close to what they could have done with it. But they just can't see it. They just can't see it. It's an audience film. It makes them laugh, the audience laugh and cry and feel like they've been on an extraordinary journey like an old Hollywood movie would. I think that's what I'm finding out from the audience. It's not some masterpiece of filmmaking. It's a very simple film. It's a bit of rough and tumble of production-wise. It was made very much in the real world, but Dave Bald Eagle touches the audience in a way that other films don't. And it's an ordinary older audience. That's the thing. As a filmmaker, you should never want to retread the same stuff. But it's unfortunate because having developed a relationship with such an audience, it's unfortunate going out with the next film to hit the market in a different way, and then you have to start from scratch again. My next production is due to be a very, very realistic geopolitical thriller set in Bulgaria. But because of the revenue from this film and the way I produce, I can just go out and shoot it. I don't need to raise money, which is very refreshing.